back to Aether Hour, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin, back from his brief hiatus. It's good to have him here. We have a really good discussion today. It's going to be sort of our Aether Hour podcast discussion about Dmitry's huge Ritual Regicide Part 2 article, which those of you that are behind the paywall have had access to for a few weeks now. Of course, it's going to be linked down below. If you haven't read Part 1 already, obviously check that out, as well as the accompanying Aether Hour discussion. This is Part 2, and of course, this article is much more extensive, over, twice, almost 3 times as long as Part 1. So it's quite the mammoth, but it is packed full of some fantastic and fascinating information, stuff that is never before been available in the English language. Frankly, some stuff that's never even been compiled together in any language. So this is something that we were very proud of here at World War Now. Eventually, all these pieces will be compiled into a Ritual Regicide book that will be available. But with all of that, I think we're going to hop right into it. Dmitry, how are you doing? Thank you for writing this wonderful piece of, really, indispensable research.
Doing well, Conrad. And, it's good. And thank you for your assistance, over the last, I would say, few months, editing it, looking through the work, fact-checking things here and there. It's been a huge help, actually, because, again, the information is very hard to translate, difficult to find. And, again, piecing together all these notes that I've put together over the last decade, it has been quite a monumental task, which is why the Part 2 of Ritual Regicide was released somewhat late. Well, before the end of the year, that's for sure. But definitely the plans initially were to release the Part 2 of Ritual Regicide in July to August. But, again, unfortunate delays have pushed it out all the way to December. But hopefully Part 3, the final part, will be putting an end to this, really, to the complex and tragic story which I think these articles investigate. And mind you, I think for all the readers looking into it, take your time looking through it. It's a bit of a heavy read. There are some, it's not really meant for children or people of a young age, but as you read through the content, I think you'll understand that it very much is an addendum to the current life of saints written for the Royal Martyrs, the Romanov family who were ritually murdered in the Yekaterinburg Ipatiev house. And I think this is the main role of the article. It's not necessarily to put a full stop to the investigation of the ritual regicide itself, but it's to kind of open the doors for the first time in the English language, and perhaps to provide an introduction so that future investigators, maybe even people working in criminalistics, people working as detectives in the future, working with archival documents, could obtain even more evidence, kind of leading us towards a more fulfilling conclusion as to what exactly took place.
No, I completely agree with all of that, and not to, make this a bigger deal than people may think it is, but in Russia right now, this position as far as the reality of the ritual regicide of the Romanov family, the Jewish Bolshevik nature of it all, and, the magical aspect of it, to which we are going to discuss today. This is, I don't want to say a fringe position, but it is not the mainstream position today in Russia that is accepted by, for example, mainstream figures in the Moscow Patriarchate, mainstream figures in the Russian government, and these sorts of things. However, there are, of course, bishops and priests and government officials that are sympathetic to this and, believe the true story behind all of this. But it's something that we believe is important for Russia and for the world to come to terms with the truth of it, come to a, national repentance for their murder of the God-ordained sovereign that was Tsar Nicholas II, who is, of course, now a canonized saint in the Orthodox Church, as are his family and his other relatives that were martyred elsewhere, which we are also going to discuss. But with all of that in mind, obviously, pray for the whole situation regarding the truth and the church, and that everything would be revealed in due time. But I guess we have to dive right in, Dmitry, to sort of the main subject of the piece and the main people we kind of have to thank for all of this, amazing information that has been coming to light. And that is Robert Wilton and Nicholas Sokolov, Nicholas Sokolov being the main investigator, the sort of the good detective cop assigned by Admiral Kolchak to investigate all of this. So if you could sort of give us the details on the background of this, what was going on at the time in the revolution, why was this so important, and why do we all frankly need to be grateful for this figure that most people don't know about in history?
Yeah, of course. So I think the book is essentially at the beginning, it dives into these two particular characters, many of which haven't received any praise for the difficult work which they've conducted under such circumstances which were completely unimaginable, right? If you think about it, there was a civil war going on. There were assassins, spies, all kinds of evil characters running around, not just Bolsheviks, but leftists, Mensheviks, liberals, agents of international capital, from America, from the UK, from various places. And yet you have this fairly young lawyer in his early 30s, Nicholas Sokolov. He travels from the Russian town of Penza, after the revolution has already taken place, he essentially abandons his home and escapes from the Bolshevik-held Penza all the way to Yekaterinburg, where he essentially is placed in charge of the investigation of the ritual murder by Admiral Alexander Kolchak. And of course, he meets and he befriends another very important key figure. This man, of course, he's of British Anglo-Saxon stock, the British Times journalist Robert Wilton. What's interesting about Robert Wilton is that he is essentially an Englishman. He was employed by the London Times newspaper. It's one of the most famous journalistic enterprises out there. It's been around since 1785, if I'm not mistaken. And he actually could speak Russian fluently. He was educated in St. Petersburg. He could speak Russian, French, English, and he was actually quite well traveled around Russia. And how he met Sokolov was very interesting through General Dieterichs, who was essentially the go-between between Sokolov and Admiral Kolchak. Now, many people have a varied view of Admiral Kolchak to begin with. They may be suspicious of him because many accuse Admiral Alexander Kolchak of being perhaps a liberal, a revolutionary. They blame him for not standing up to the Tsar, not protecting the Tsar in February of 1917 during the liberal Freemasonic Revolution. Many even accuse Admiral Kolchak of being a Freemason himself, although there is no real archival or any sort of documents evidencing that. If anything, we'd see Admiral Kolchak's position on the revolution change quite drastically from early February of 1917, when Admiral Kolchak, I believe he was 41 years of age, quite young. He was actually the youngest admiral to serve during World War I, and he was extremely talented. His main service was on the Black Sea, and he was actually preparing the expedition which was going to take back Istanbul, Constantinople from the Turkish Ottoman Empire when the revolution took place. And he, of course, wasn't on the front lines where Tsar Nicholas II was taken captive and where allegedly the pencil-signed abdication was written in the train carriage at the Dnor station near Pskov. But Admiral Kolchak, nevertheless, never really signed any letters and really didn't stand up to the Freemasons, which took power, such as the Kerensky government in February of March of 1917. So many people accuse Admiral Kolchak of being this bad guy revolutionary, when in fact, I think his main sin was that of, say, the apostles when Christ was taken to the Sanhedrin and then crucified, whereas he was just simply fearful and maybe even unsure of how to act in the context of the First World War. And so he let the Tsar be taken captive, and then, of course, the royal family taken from St. Petersburg to Tobolsk and later to Yekaterinburg. And only when Admiral Kolchak becomes the new leader of the White Army during the Russian Civil War does he have this somewhat internalized transformation. He kind of repents for his sin, and he puts all of his effort, despite the fact that many of the allies were quite skeptical of the entire royal martyr investigation in the first place. Nobody really wanted to investigate the Ipatiev house and the murder of the Romanovs, but he put exceptional effort into having General Mikhail Dieterichs, who was of a similar sort of background. Again, a very young general during World War I, and he becomes a very pious Orthodox Christian as the Civil War progresses. In the end, he becomes almost, people call him a zealot and like a radical like maybe an ortho-bro, you could say, but he becomes a very radical Orthodox Christian. And Mikhail Dieterichs, as well as Sokolov, with the assistance of Robert Wilton, they write the first 3 books about the Romanov Royal Martyrs, which can be taken as primary evidence as to what took place. And these works we actually cite quite extensively. So what was Robert Wilton's main contribution to the entire investigation? How does it relate to the ritual aspect? Well, Robert Wilton, his experience as a journalist, of course, and his sort of writing skills were also heavily intertwined with his ability to take very accurate photographs in many different circumstances, and as well as processing those photographs at really effective speeds. So he would actually take photographs of the inside of the Ipatiev house, various rooms. All the photographs, well, the majority of the photographs we have of the Ipatiev house from the inside, everything from the wall you see with the bullet holes in it to the various photographs of the blood splatters on the walls, the furniture being thrown around, the destruction, the outside of the houses as well. And of course, the famous photographs of the cabbalograms, the Talmudic ritualistic graffiti we see in the wall. All of these were made by Robert Wilton. So he essentially took this unbiased, objective perspective, processed the photographs for Nicholas Sokolov, and assisted Nicholas Sokolov to come to these conclusions that potentially there's more to it than it wasn't just an execution-style shooting in a very clumsily put together setting, essentially in a crammed basement with, as the next part of the ritual regicide will kind of conclude, allegedly there were up to 24 people stacked together in this one little basement, which is essentially something like 4 by 5 meters at best, which is kind of difficult to imagine if you can just imagine the chance of ricochet and all the other risks involved. Kind of difficult to imagine. But he assisted Sokolov and General Dmitriy and even Admiral Kolchak to come to these conclusions. Unfortunately, Admiral Kolchak was later killed by the Bolsheviks, and he was betrayed by the French as well as the Czechoslovakian Legion. So he doesn't necessarily survive to come to Sokolov and Dmitriyk's conclusions. But Dmitriy and Sokolov managed to get out of Russia after the end of the Civil War, and both of them come to the really interesting conclusions that this murder had a ritualistic aspect to it. And now what you'll notice is Robert Wilton as well was accused, after he published his book, The Last Days of the Romanovs, in English, actually, and it was published in London. He was actually fired from the Times newspaper for allegedly being an anti-Semite because he dared to publish photographs of the cabalogram as well as some of the other symbols he found in the Ipatiev house. And he, of course, concluded that by the way, his book, The Last Days of the Romanovs, that actually also lists some of the leaders of the Bolshevik Party. And this is the first book actually in print published in the 1920s, which mentions that the majority of the Bolshevik leadership were actually of Jewish stock and of that sort of background. So for this, he was actually fired for his work. You can say this is almost like an early example of cancel culture. And then Robert Wilton moved to France, where he lived close to Nicholas Sokolov, and he died essentially a very poor man with little to no resources. So essentially he was completely cancelled, economically suppressed. The same fate befell Nicholas Sokolov, who had to essentially live off what you can only say would be similar to a pension. Nobody financially supported these people, despite the fact of how important they were to the entire investigation process. It's very interesting that even today, their work is so unappreciated. But getting to the conclusions, what exactly did they find in the Ipatiev house during those first few months? Now, it needs to be said that when Nicholas Sokolov, this young lawyer and prosecutor, was put in charge of the case, already 5 to 6 months have passed since the murder of the Romanovs. So when Nicholas Sokolov arrived in Yekaterinburg at the Ipatiev house, it was already early 1918. So it was already early 1919. So essentially, you can imagine 5 to 6 months, the house was very poorly guarded. Anyone could have walked into the house. There were all kinds of concerns about its security. It wasn't a properly sealed crime scene, as you can see in many detective shows and in many criminalistic protocols carried out today. So again, the forensic investigation was very limited. But what Sokolov and his assistants Namyotkin as well as Sergeyev found was that the graffiti written on the wall was written prior to the arrival of the White Army in Yekaterinburg, and the graffiti had almost no connection to the actual crime. We'll mention the graffiti, I think, a bit later, Conrad, but what's also peculiar is that Sokolov found very distinct marks, not just the bullet hole marks on the wall. He found blood sprinkling in places where seemingly the blood shouldn't have been found in the first place. And he made very interesting remarks in his book. Sokolov wrote that there was blood sprinkling all around the house, near the windowsill. And essentially the blood sprinkling, he even estimated and measured as to how far the sprinklings of blood were from one another, and that they were mixed with water, almost as if, as you can imagine, in the Orthodox Church, when the priest carries around holy water and they sprinkle and bless a house. In this particular matter, we have an example of essentially this unholy simulacrum of an Orthodox Christian ritual where blood is sprinkled around a certain ritual sacrificial site, like an altar in a way. And Nicholas Sokolov kind of makes this remark, which leads us to the conclusion that, yes, essentially, a blood was sprinkled all around the house in a certain pattern, perhaps in line with some sort of Talmudic ritual. The other interesting aspect of the basement in the Ipatiev house that Nicholas Sokolov and Wilton sort of came to witness personally was that there were these shavings which were found on the floor. And so essentially, for whatever reason, the Bolsheviks, they carried bags of wooden shavings, like essentially shavings that you'd get from timber or wood, and they would sprinkle them all over the basement floor. Apparently, this was to soak up the blood of the innocent victims, which were later executed in the basement. Some of those shavings, in one of the memoirs of the murderers, those shavings were allegedly swept into the basement of the house. Now, what's curious is they found none of those shavings in the house basement later on. So where did those soaked blood shavings go? No one really knows to this day. It's quite a mystery. There were also reports of bloody rags found on the floors, which were then also not identified, and all kinds of other interesting details, some of which I think the next part of the Ritual Regicide article will cover. In particular, bayonet marks and marks of knives maybe weapons such as stilettos on the ceiling and all the walls of the entrance, as if when a Bolshevik with a sharp needle-like bayonet would come through the doorway, they would accidentally scratch the knife or the bayonet against the wall. And so on the actual entrance to the doorway, because the basement was so narrow, they did find those knife marks, which was quite distinct. And Sokolov does make reference to that. But I think the most distinct evidence found in the basement itself, besides, of course, the wall with all the bullet holes and still some samples of blood, very distinctly, clearly laid out on the wall itself, is those, of course, the poem from Heinrich Heine, the cousin of Karl Marx, of course, left by a hand of some sort of Bolshevik poet who knew the poem by Heinrich Heine off by heart regarding Belshazzar in the Old Testament, as well as the four-symbol cabalogram, which I think is one of the most crucial pieces of evidence. And this is why such a large part of Ritual Regicide Part 2 is dedicated towards this particular cabalogram. It's one of those elements which needs to be deciphered and discussed in the most thorough detail. It's also, the cabalogram is one of the pieces of the regicide puzzle, which is mentioned in the 1981 Rokor Synod, which canonized the new martyrs as well as the Royal Romanov family. So in Jordanville, New York, when that council came together under the leadership of the future Saint Philaret of New York as well. So he was the Metropolitan of Rokor at the time, the first hierarch. So it's very important. These things were mentioned at a particular Orthodox Christian council, one of the most important councils, I would say, of the 20th century. And so why not discuss some of these Talmudic symbols in depth, especially what they mean, and is there any connection to, can these symbols be in some way deciphered, and were they deciphered at the time?
Yeah, everybody really needs to check out the full article. There are dozens and dozens of images in there, some of the Robert Wilton images that he took, as well as, recreations and close-ups with, even some of the descriptions of the images have, are full paragraphs that Dmitry wrote. So there's really rich information in there, and it shows all of this forensic analysis, again, which you're not going to find anywhere else. And I think the poem by Karl Marx's cousin is just absolutely insane, as well as the cabalogram, which we're going to get into extensively. But I think before we discuss the hardcore details on that, we want to discuss exactly the importance of why the ritual regicide and its knowledge in Russia and around the world of the Tsar is so important. And I think you already mentioned the abdication, which, is already disputed, and we've discussed extensively on the show before, and all of these things. I believe in the article, there's also a discussion that the Tsar, in many ways, had some prophetic understanding of what may befall him, and had, kind of offered himself up in many ways as a sacrifice for the sake of his people. And when you understand, of course, you mentioned Robert Wilton getting, fired for anti-Semitism, it seems that that was the conclusion that Sokolov and Wilton came to very quickly, based on, again, the even disrupted months later crime scene that they were given access to by Dieterichs and Kolchak as the Bolsheviks, closed in on the White Army, which, again, we know they unfortunately would win the Russian Civil War. So we need to ask about that as well. We know there was the letter from Saint Seraphim of Sarov, which I know there are some disputed ideas as to what that said. So again, before we talk about the specific cabalogram and the poem and the things that the changes, for example, that this Jewish Bolshevik probably made to the poem and that significance, what exactly how was the lead up to this, and, which Jews ended up carrying, this act out specifically, as we know, even from the mainstream narrative, and what was the preparation and spiritual state of the family going into this situation, into what we know is a ritual regicide?
Yeah, it's very interesting because, many ancient cultures, pagan cultures, and those even mentioned in the Old Testament, in the Bible, they reference the fact that the king is the king or the sovereign, the autocrat, is the personification of the entire nation or people, which is why it's not really a democratic concept of, well, the power comes from the people, but more like the one individual in charge represents the people, and he is also held responsible and he's accountable, as well as his well-being is essentially his well-being is the well-being of the entire nation altogether. So if, of course, the king or the sovereign is put to death, the entire people will either suffer or benefit from his fall. And this is why many ancient cultures, as mentioned here, I reference Sir James Fraser's book, The Golden Bow, which covers, in ancient Rome, they actually had an ancient ritual wherein a sacred priest on the Lake Nemi would pretend to be a ritual priest, and every year or every few years, the ancient Romans would send an assassin to kill that ritual priest who would live as an ascetic monk of sorts on this island in the middle of the lake. And this particular ritual priest would pretend to be a king. And then, of course, the assassin would, once he would kill that priest king, he would take his place. And even the ancient Romans had this particular ritual of king slaying in a way. This is even when ancient Rome was a republic again. Of course, many other cultures in Africa, all over the world, actually had this concept, including ancient Babylon, had this concept of if your king was to be slain in a ritual regicide of sorts, then a particular effect would come about. Now, notice the effect that we speak of, it's usually mystical in meaning. And again, these people, most of them, of course, do not come from a right-believing society. So again, it's deeply paganistic superstition which is associated with these mystical acts. And this is why I think it's very curious to see why the Bolsheviks had this obsession with taking Tsar Nicholas II out, despite the fact that he already allegedly abdicated and he had no political power whatsoever. And it wasn't just that they wanted to execute him for his crimes, because there was no legal investigation into any of his crimes. The execution or the alleged murder of Tsar Nicholas II wasn't secular at all. It was, in fact, deeply mystical. And there's nothing wrong. It's not a very complex conclusion to come to, especially if you read, for example, the anthropological histories of ritual murders in various societies around the planet, and specifically in Europe, and as well as Central Asia and other places. And I think the most clear example of this, again, is the murder of Jesus Christ, his crucifixion. And he was, of course, an innocent man, an innocent God-man who was slain and crucified by the Jews and by the Sanhedrin, and who, of course, almost in a mocking type sense, again, screamed out, "May his blood be on us and on our children." And this is, of course, very deeply significant, because we understand that with this crucifixion and with the lack of repentance, the fall of the tribe of Judah and those remaining Israelites who, again, were not dispersed after the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests also began. An entire people have fallen under the power of the devil with the crucifixion of the Lord. And so, again, we even understand that in our own Orthodox Christian tradition, and of course, amongst all Christian denominations, it's very clear that even the New Testament history kind of commences with a particular ritual killing of course, the Messiah. So it's very interesting and very significant that the fact that these Talmudic individuals, these Bolsheviks, people like Yakov Yurovsky, Yakov Sverdlov, etc., have all essentially invested themselves into carrying out this ritual at a specific time in a particular place, as mentioned in the previous Aether episode on the ritual regicide at the Ipatiev house. Now, what's even more curious is, again, the weight that the Orthodox Christian community placed on Tsar Nicholas II, him being the katechon, the restrainer, again, and the fact that he was completely powerless, isolated, as well as his family as well. It kind of only added to this particular effect that his murder would have a substantial impact on the entire Russian people.
Thank you so much for listening to the free preview of this huge Aether Hour episode where we discuss further the ritual regicide of the Romanov Royal Martyrs. We discuss the details of the investigation into their murder, the details of the ritual behind it, the cabalistic symbols and other symbols written on the wall by the Talmudic murderers, and so much more about them, the Alapaesk Martyrs, so much more. So get behind that paywall and hear the full episode. And if you want to read the full article, 50,000 plus words, the link to that full ritual regicide part 2 is down below. And if you get behind the paywall, you not only get access to this massive episode, but also 60 plus other huge Aether Hour episodes. So please financially support the show. Hear this full episode, read the article down below, and we will see you on the other side. God bless.